The great hall of the Galactic Council fell silent when High Arbiter Velnik raised his forearms and the ancient holographic projector flickered to life before the assembled ambassadors from 47 different species who had gathered for this emergency session that had been called without explanation. A massive three-dimensional map of the galaxy appeared in the center of the room, and every eye and sensor turned to look at the glowing red zone that stretched across 3 spiral arms and covered nearly 12,000 star systems where no trade routes existed and no exploration vessels had traveled in living memory. For those who are new to this council, Velnik began in a voice that carried the weight of ancestral fear that the universal translator struggled to convey properly. This region is called Sector Zero, and our ancestors knew it by another name, which they spoke only in whispers, as the Human Expanse. Ambassador Kryn of the Valori Federation lifted one of her slender appendages to request permission to speak, and her species had only discovered faster than light travel 300 years ago, so she knew very little about the ancient history that the elder species seemed so reluctant to discuss. I have spent many cycles searching the historical archives for information about this forbidden zone, she said with confusion evident in her voice. But I find only deleted files and encrypted warnings that tell me nothing useful, and my people want to know why such a large portion of habitable space remains permanently closed to all travel. Several of the older ambassadors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the Moldari representative made a gesture that indicated deep unease, while others simply looked away as if the mere mention of this topic brought back memories they would rather forget. Velnik nodded slowly, and his expression grew dark as he prepared to share knowledge that had been carefully guarded for 50,000 standard years since the last contact with the species that had once occupied that vast region of space. You ask about the humans, he said in barely more than a whisper, and perhaps enough time has passed that the younger species should finally understand why we created the quarantine and why we will maintain it until the stars themselves grow cold and die. He gestured again, and the hologram shifted to show a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy where nothing special should have ever happened. Everything began here on a world they called Earth. The story that Velnik told stretched back 53,000 years to a time when the galactic community had been at the height of its golden age, with 212 species living together in relative peace under the covenant of peaceful exchange. Wars were rare in those days, and when they did occur, they followed strict rules that prohibited civilian casualties and the destruction of inhabited worlds, and trade flourished while art and science advanced, and everyone believed that the galaxy had finally achieved a lasting peace that would continue forever. Then a survey vessel called the Illuminated Path discovered the third planet of the Soul. System Commander Trexen of the Moldari Exploration Course had been a junior navigator on that ship, and he remembered the day clearly, even in the final centuries of his extended lifespan, when he recorded his testimony for the historical archives. When the sensors detected primitive radio signals coming from the blue planet, the entire crew had celebrated because they believed they had found a new species to welcome into the galactic community and a new culture to enrich the tapestry of civilizations. They approached with all standard first contact protocols in place and broadcast peaceful signals on every frequency while their weapon systems remained powered down and their translation programs worked to decode the strange transmissions. What they found instead was a species in the process of destroying itself. The humans were fighting what their own historians would later call the Third World. War and nuclear fire bloomed across 3 of their continents, while cities burned and millions died in the first hours of the conflict that seemed to have no purpose except mutual annihilation. We should leave this place, the captain of the Illuminated Path had said while watching the destruction unfold on his view screen, because this species will not survive another orbit around their star. But they were wrong about that, and their mistake would change the galaxy. Forever first contact did not happen through careful diplomatic channels or planned meetings between representatives, because instead, it happened through pure desperation when a crude human spacecraft intercepted the illuminated path as it prepared to leave the system. The vessel was damaged and leaking atmosphere, and its single occupant was broadcasting frantically on every frequency his primitive equipment could reach while his world burned beneath him. His name was Kevin Walsh, and he had been a pilot from a nation called the United States that no longer existed because the bombs had fallen while he was on a routine orbital patrol, and his family was somewhere in the radioactive ruins below. If they had survived at all, the Moldari crew debated what to do because their protocol said they should not interfere with pre-contact species, but they could not bring themselves to abandon a sapient being to die alone in the cold emptiness of space. They brought Kevin Walsh aboard and used their advanced medical technology to treat his radiation sickness, and they tried to communicate with him using their translation systems. What happened next would later be classified at the highest levels of galactic security, and the records would be sealed for 10,000 years. Kevin Walsh listened as the Moldari captain explained that they had been observing Earth during its final war, and that their laws prohibited them from interfering in the internal affairs of pre-contact civilizations. No matter how terrible the situation might appear, he did not cry or scream or beg for help as many species would have done in his situation, and instead, his face took on an expression that the Moldari had never seen before on any sapient being. The translator struggled to identify the emotion, and the closest word it could find was cold fury. "You watch this burn," Kevin Walsh said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "and you did nothing to stop it. The Covenant is clear on this matter," the captain replied gently, "and we could not intervene without an invitation from your government, which no longer exists." Kevin Walsh was silent for a long moment, and then he smiled. The Moldari had never seen a human smile before, and they did not understand that this particular expression meant something very different from happiness or friendliness. "Tell me about this covenant of yours," Kevin Walsh said while his eyes remained cold and calculating, "and tell me everything about how your galaxy works." The illuminated path returned Kevin Walsh to his dying world at his own request, and they gave him medical supplies and food, and a communication device that would let him contact them if he changed his mind about staying. They did not expect to ever hear from him again. 18 months later, the device activated, but the voice that came through was not Kevin Walsh. A woman named Lisa Monroe identified herself as the director of the Human Reconstruction Authority, and she spoke with calm precision that carried the weight of someone who had spent the past year organizing survivors and rebuilding what remained of human civilization. "We accept your offer of first contact," she said, "but we have conditions that must be met before any negotiations can proceed." The Galactic Council was intrigued by this unexpected development because they had assumed the humans would be extinct by now, and they agreed to send a diplomatic delegation to see what had become of the species that had nearly destroyed itself. What they found when they arrived shocked them to their core and made them question everything they thought they knew about how civilizations developed. The human population had fallen to approximately 200 million individuals since scattered across the least damaged areas of their world, and by every calculation, they should have been fighting over scraps and slowly dying out. Instead, they had built a functioning government and established communication networks across 5 continents and begun cleaning the radiation from their poisoned lands. Lisa Monroe explained it simply when she met with the council representatives for the first official negotiations. "We looked into the face of our own extinction," she said with eyes that carried the weight of 300 million deaths, "and we decided together that we would never allow ourselves to become that species again." The council found this attitude admirable. if somewhat naive, and they approved. Humanity for provisional membership in the galactic community. It was the worst decision in galactic history. For the first 100 years after joining the galactic community, the humans behaved exactly as everyone expected them to behave, and they accepted technological help with humble gratitude while sending their brightest young people to study at the great universities of the elder species. They learned languages and customs and asked endless questions about everything from faster-than-light travel to the complex history of galactic politics, and the Council saw a species slowly recovering from near extinction while taking its proper place among the stars. They did not see what was happening beneath the surface, where a small group of humans had begun planning for a future that the galaxy could not imagine. Kevin Walsh now served as humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Council, and he spent his days attending diplomatic functions and making friends with representatives from dozens of species, while learning everything he could about how the galaxy really worked. But his nights were different because he spent them reading military histories and technological specifications and writing detailed reports about every species in the community that he sent back to Earth through encrypted channels. He noted their strengths and their weaknesses, and most importantly, he identified their blind spots and the assumptions they made about how civilization should behave. A small group back on Earth received these reports and studied them carefully in a bunker beneath the rebuilt city of New Chicago, where they called themselves the Quiet Council and worked toward a single goal. Lisa Monroe was there along with a former military strategist named Daniel Peters and a physicist named Maria Santos, who had lost her entire research team when the bombs fell on Buenos Aires. The covenant of peaceful exchange has a fundamental flaw, Kevin Walsh wrote in one of his reports, because it assumes all species share similar values about conflict, and it provides no way to address threats before they become dangerous enough to destroy entire civilizations. Daniel Peters read this report and underlined one sentence 3 times where Kevin Walsh had written that the elder species had been legally correct to watch humanity burn without helping. They let us die, Daniel Peters said to the others gathered around the table, and their own laws said they were right to do so. And what happens next time when some other species decides that humans are inconvenient? The answer was simple, and they all agreed on it without much discussion, because they would make sure that no one ever had the chance to threaten humanity again. The first sign of trouble came 70 years after first contact in the form of a trade dispute that seemed minor at the time, but would later be recognized as the beginning of everything that followed. The Valori Federation had established exclusive rights to mine a rich asteroid belt near human space under an agreement made when humanity was still desperate for any economic opportunity it could find. Now, humans had developed their own mining technology, and they asked to renegotiate the terms so they could have a larger share of resources from their own neighborhood. The Valori refused because the original contract was binding under galactic law, and humanity had agreed to those terms freely, and there was nothing more to discuss. Most species would have filed a complaint with the Council and waited decades for it to be resolved, but humanity took a different approach that surprised everyone. A human mining vessel discovered a new deposit of valuable ore just outside the boundary of the Valori claim and began extracting it immediately while working around the clock to process as much material as possible. When Valori security ships arrived to demand that the humans stop their operations, they found not one mining vessel but 12, and each one was equipped with defensive weapons that had not existed in human space. 6 months earlier, Captain Silmac of the Valori security force was experienced enough to recognize that something had changed, and he requested instructions from his commanders, who contacted the Galactic Council, who sent a formal inquiry to the human ambassador. Kevin Walsh responded with perfect politeness and explained that humanity was operating within the exact letter of galactic law because their mining operations were outside the Valori Claim zone. Those defensive systems are military grade. The council representative pointed out. So where did you get them? We built them ourselves, Kevin Walsh said with a slight smile. Because our engineers have been very productive lately. The Valori withdrew rather than risk a fight in it. Was a small victory, but it established a pattern that would repeat many times over the following decades. Humanity never started conflicts and never explicitly broke any laws, but they found every loophole and exploited every ambiguity and pushed every boundary until their neighbors had to choose between backing down or starting a war. Nobody wanted to start a war with a species that had survived nuclear apocalypse through pure determination, and nobody wanted to fight people who seemed to learn new technologies faster than should have been possible by the 200th year after first contact. Humanity controlled a volume of space roughly equal to the Valori Federation, despite having been a pre-spacefaring civilization less than 2 centuries before their population had recovered to nearly 8 billion, spread across 47 colony worlds, and their military was estimated to be the 4th largest in the galaxy, even though it was officially described as purely defensive. The council watched with growing worry but could find no legal grounds for action, because humanity had not broken any rules and they participated in all the required diplomatic functions and paid their trade fees and even helped with collective defense against the occasional space hazard. They were model citizens in every way, and somehow that made them more frightening than any obvious threat would have been. The breaking point came from a direction that nobody expected when one of the Thracian Dominion's client species decided to do something that had never been done before. The Kethrani had been under Thracian protection for 60,000 years in an arrangement where they provided resources and labor in exchange for technology and defense, and it was a system that had worked without serious problems for longer than most species had existed. But the Kethrani had been watching humanity and learning from their example, and when a delegation of them arrived on Earth requesting asylum and alliance, they brought stories of how the Thracians had kept them deliberately underdeveloped for thousands of generations. We cannot fight them ourselves, the Kethrani spokesperson said, but we have heard that humans do not accept injustice quietly, and we have heard that you remember what it means to be powerless and alone. Daniel Peters, now serving as humanity's Secretary of Defense, made an announcement that shocked the entire galaxy when he declared that Earth would protect the Kethrani delegation. Any attempt to take them back by force would be considered an act of war against humanity. The Galactic Council demanded an explanation and accused humanity of interfering in the internal affairs of the Thracian Dominion, which was a clear violation of the principles everyone had agreed to follow. Kevin Walsh requested permission to speak, and when he stood before the council, his response was devastating in its simplicity. The Covenant prohibits interference with pre-contact species, he said calmly, but the Kethrani have been spacefaring for 60,000 years, so they are not pre-contact, and therefore the non-interference rules do not apply to them. High Arbiter Velnuk of the Thracians practically snarled when he accused humanity of twisting the law with word games. I am applying your laws exactly as you wrote them, Kevin Walsh replied, and perhaps if they had been enforced more consistently, we would not be having this conversation today. He then announced that humanity was formally proposing amendments to the Covenant of Peaceful Exchange, and he listed them one by one while the council watched in stunned, silent. Interference would no longer apply to any species with faster than light travel, and the practice of keeping client species would be abolished, and a new peacekeeping force would be created to intervene when populations faced oppression. These are not requests, Kevin Walsh said as he finished, and they are requirements for humanity's continued participation in this body, and you have 1 standard year to ratify them. He paused, and his expression hardened into something that made even the oldest ambassadors want to look away. We have learned much from you over the past 2 centuries, he said. And the most important lesson was that the galaxy respects only power, and that justice without strength is just wishful thinking. We have built our strength, and now we will use it for justice. He turned and walked out of the chamber, leaving the representatives in shocked silence behind him. The year that followed Kevin Walsh's ultimatum was the most tense period in galactic history, as humanity began a military buildup that defied every projection. The elder species had made about what was possible shipyards across human space operated without stopping and produced vessels of designs that no one had ever seen before, while recruitment offices were overwhelmed with volunteers who wanted to serve in what was being called the greatest cause in human history. But the most disturbing development was that other species began sending their own people to join the human forces, because the Kethrani were only the first to request protection. The Vortian, who had been under Thracian control, came next, and then the Delani, who had served the Moldari for 30,000 years, and then the Kreth and the Samani and the Toraki, who had all been kept in similar arrangements by various elder species. Each time humanity welcomed them, and each time they were brought into a growing coalition that called itself the Alliance of Free Species, and each time the old powers had to decide whether to fight or accept that their traditional authority was slipping away. Most of them chose to back down because the risks of fighting were simply too great. Daniel Peters oversaw military preparations from his command center on Mars, where his staff now included humans and Kethrani and members of half a dozen other species who had chosen to stand with humanity against the established order. The Thracians will test us eventually, he told his senior officers during one briefing session, because they cannot accept these changes without a fight, since it would mean admitting that everything they built over 500,000 years was wrong. Commander Grace Liu, who was one of humanity's most decorated naval officers, asked what would happen if they were forced to respond with actual combat. Then we show the galaxy exactly what we can do, Daniel Peters replied, and we hope it will be enough to end this quickly. The test came sooner than anyone expected when the Thracian Dominion announced that they would be conducting routine military exercises near the Kethrani homeworld with 200 warships, including 3 massive dreadnoughts. It was technically legal because the Council had not formally recognized Kethrani independence, so their planet was still considered Thracian territory. But the message was clear to everyone watching. The Thracians were showing the galaxy who really held power. Humanity's response was equally clear when the Alliance First Fleet jumped to the edge of the Kethrani system within 6 hours under the command of Admiral Paul Henderson. His force included 112 warships, and most of them were newly built with weapon systems that had never been tested in real combat against an enemy. This is Admiral Henderson calling Thracian Fleet Command. Paul Henderson broadcast on open frequencies so everyone could hear, and the Alliance of Free Species recognizes Kethrani sovereignty, so any attack on their world will be treated as an act of war against all of us. For 17 days, the two fleets faced each other across the void, without either side firing a weapon or backing down, while diplomats worked desperately behind the scenes to find some solution that would let both powers save face. It was Maria Santos who finally broke the deadlock, but not through negotiation. She was now 112 years old, with her life extended by the same medical technology that humanity had once received as charity from the Moldari, and she had spent the past century studying every piece of galactic technology she could find. Her request to address the Dars, the Council, was granted with reluctance, because everyone was already on edge, and they did not want to hear more threats from the humans. But Maria Santos did not bring threats, because she brought something far more terrifying in the form of a demonstration. For 200 years, humanity has been accused of many things. She began as she stood before the assembled representatives, and perhaps some of those accusations have merit, because we are not patient and we do not accept injustice quietly. She paused to let the translators catch up with her words. But no one has ever accused us of being stupid, and we have learned everything you taught us very well. She activated a holographic display that showed technical diagrams so complex that most council members could not even begin to understand them. This is called a singularity engine, she explained, and it converts matter directly into energy through controlled gravitational collapse with an efficiency of approximately 97%. Murmurs spread through the chamber as some of the more scientifically minded representatives began to realize what they were looking at. A ship with this engine could cross the entire galaxy in days instead of months, and a single engine could power a civilization for thousands of years. She let silence hang in the air for a moment. And if it were turned into a weapon, it could destroy stars. The Moldari ambassador rose slowly to his feet because his species was perhaps the only one present that truly understood the implications of what Maria Santos had just revealed. You have created weapons capable of ending solar systems, he said in a voice that was barely audible. We have created tools with many possible uses, Maria Santos replied calmly. And destroying stars is actually one of the less interesting applications. But yes, if necessary, we could make any system in the galaxy uninhabitable within hours. The chamber erupted in chaos, with representatives shouting over each other in dozens of languages, while some delegations simply got up and left. Maria Santos waited patiently for the noise to die down before she continued. Humanity did not build these engines to threaten anyone, she said when she could be heard again, because we built them to make sure we would never be helpless again. But we also remember what it felt like to stare into extinction, and we do not want to make anyone else experience that horror. We want only justice and the right of all thinking beings to control their own futures and an end to the comfortable arrangements that have allowed the powerful to use the weak for millions of years. She deactivated the display and looked around. The chamber had faces that showed fear and anger, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. You have 6 months to approve the new covenant, and if you do not, then humanity will leave this body and establish the alliance. As an independent power, we will recognize any species that asks for sovereignty, and we will protect any population facing oppression, and we will use every tool we have to make sure no one ever again has to watch their world die while the galaxy does nothing. She walked toward the exit and paused at the doorway to deliver her final words. We are not asking for permission, because we are telling you what we intend to do, and how you respond will shape the next million years of history. 4 months later, the Galactic Council ratified the amended Covenant of Peaceful Exchange by an overwhelming vote, because even the Thracians recognized that resistance against human technology was pointless. The client species were freed, and the peacekeeping force was created, and the galaxy entered a new age that was defined not by the comfortable stability of the old order, but by the uncertain promise of real equality. Not everyone was happy with these changes, and the elder species, who had enjoyed their privileged position for so long, resented the upstart humans who had overturned millions of years of tradition in just a few centuries. Plots were made and secret alliances were formed, and attempts were launched to contain or undermine or destroy the human threat. None of them succeeded. Admiral Paul Henderson stood on the bridge of his flagship as it emerged from faster-than-light travel in the Valori system, where a coalition of elder species had assembled to make one final stand against humanity. Their fleet outnumbered the Alliance forces by nearly 3-1, and they were demanding surrender. Paul Henderson smiled the same smile that Kevin Walsh had shown to the Moldari captain 2 centuries before. All ships activate singularity engines, he ordered. Full combat configuration. Space itself seemed to shudder as the engines came online, and Valori sensors registered energy readings that should have been impossible. You have one chance, Paul Henderson broadcast to the enemy fleet. So stand down and accept the new order, or learn what happens when humanity has nothing left to lose. The battle lasted 7 minutes, and the Alliance lost no ships while the enemy coalition was completely destroyed, with survivors fleeing to the far corners of the galaxy, carrying stories of weapons that could bend reality itself. It was the last organized resistance to human authority. 500 years after first contact, humanity controlled approximately 40% of all known galactic space, but not because they had conquered it through force of arms. Species from every corner of the galaxy had chosen to join the Alliance because they were attracted by promises of protection and equality that the old order had never offered them. The traditional powers retreated to their ancestral territories and watched with bitter resentment as everything they had built over millions of years was transformed by creatures who had been burning their own planet. Just a few centuries before Lisa Monroe had lived to see the first century of this new era before finally dying at the age of 187, and in her final writings she tried to explain what humanity had accomplished. "We did not set out to rule the galaxy," she wrote, "because we only wanted to make sure no one could ever watch innocent people suffer and choose to do nothing about it. If that meant becoming the most powerful force in existence, then so be it, because power without purpose is just cruelty, and purpose without power is just wishing." By the 1000th year, the Alliance had evolved into something that had never existed before, which was a true galactic civilization that included hundreds of species and thousands of star systems. United not by conquest, but by shared beliefs, conflicts still happened, but they were managed through institutions that humans had helped create, and disputes were resolved through processes that gave every species a voice, and the weak were protected from the strong. At the center of it all were the humans who served as peacekeepers and diplomats and scientists and teachers, and who spread their particular brand of stubborn idealism wherever they went. They married members of other species and adopted children from dozens of worlds, and they were not always liked or understood, but they were always respected. Elder species gradually came to accept that the old ways were gone forever, and some of them found new purposes in the changed galaxy, while others retreated into isolation to nurse their grievances in silence, and a few of the most bitter and proud began to plan for revenge. The final war started in the 3000th year after first contact, when a coalition of elder species led by what remained of the Thracian Dominion launched a coordinated attack on Alliance territories. They had spent 2,000 years preparing in secret by developing new weapons and building hidden fleets and placing agents inside Alliance institutions. Their goal was the complete destruction of humanity and the restoration of the traditional galactic order that had existed before those upstart apes from Earth had ruined everything. They believed they had planned for every possibility and accounted for every variable that could affect the outcome. They were wrong. The war lasted 47 years, and it was fought across every part of the galaxy, with casualties counted in the trillions as entire star systems were destroyed, and species that had existed for millions of years were pushed to the edge of extinction. And when it finally ended, humanity had won. The victory cost them everything they had built. Kevin Walsh VII was a direct descendant of the original human ambassador, and he stood before the Allied Council of Species in the year 3047 with a holographic display behind him showing the devastation that the war had caused, burned planets and dead stars and the ruins of civilizations that had once stretched across light years, filled the projection as representatives from species that had been reduced to a handful of survivors watched in silence. "We have won," he said with exhaustion heavy in his voice. "And the coalition that tried to destroy us has been defeated, and the leaders who started this war have faced justice." He paused and looked around at the assembly, where many faces bore scars from the conflict, both physical and otherwise. "But this cannot be allowed to happen again. We proved that we would fight, and we proved that we would win, and we proved that no force in the galaxy can threaten human existence without facing consequences beyond imagination. And yet the war came anyway. He turned off the display and faced the council directly. I am proposing something that goes against every instinct our species has developed over 3,000 years. I am proposing that humanity withdraw. Shock spread through the chamber as representatives struggled to understand what he was saying. Not from the Alliance, and not from our promises to our partners, but from direct involvement in galactic affairs. We will return to our original territories and the systems we have held since the earliest days of our expansion, and we will keep our defenses, but we will not grow any larger. We will not interfere, and we will not lead. The galaxy must learn to govern itself without depending on human power, and the other species must build their own institutions and their own ways of keeping peace. He looked directly at the recording devices, knowing his words would be heard across the entire galaxy. And to make sure our withdrawal is respected, we are establishing a final warning. Any species that enters human space without an explicit invitation will be destroyed. Not defeated or conquered, but completely and utterly destroyed. We have the ability to do this, and we have shown the will to use it, and we will not hesitate. This is not a threat, but a promise, because we are tired of war and tired of being the galaxy's protectors and police and conscience. We want only to be left alone to live in peace among ourselves. We have earned that right with blood. Respect our borders and honor the principles we established, and build a galaxy worth living in. And never forget what happens when humanity is pushed too far. He stepped down from the platform and walked out of the chamber for the last time. The withdrawal took a century to complete as human populations spread across the galaxy were given the choice to return to their ancestral space or stay with their adopted species. Most chose to return, while some remained behind as permanent ambassadors to the worlds they had made their homes. Border was established with terrible precision, and warning beacons were placed at every approach, broadcasting in every known language. This is human space, and entry without invitation means death. There will be no warnings, and there will be no negotiations. Turn back now. Few species tested these warnings in the early centuries, and their fates served as powerful lessons to everyone else. The Krolani sent a diplomatic vessel, hoping to negotiate trade agreements, and it was vaporized before it crossed the border. The Thracian remnants sent a stealth ship to gather intelligence, and it was detected and destroyed within seconds of entering the Forbidden Zone. The Valori attempted to send a probe, disguised as a piece of space debris, and the probe was annihilated, along with the ship that had launched it from what they thought was a safe distance. After a few thousand years, the attempts stopped entirely, because everyone understood that the humans meant exactly what they said. 50,000 years passed, and no species entered human space. The warning beacons continued to broadcast their messages without interruption and observation. Posts at the very edge of the Forbidden Zone reported occasional signs of activity deep within, but no ships ever emerged, and no communications were ever attempted. Humanity had turned inward and cut itself off from the galaxy it had once dominated. Some species believed they had destroyed themselves in some final catastrophe, while others thought they had evolved beyond physical existence and ascended to a higher plane. A few of the oldest beings who remembered the ancient histories believed that humans were simply waiting, because patience had always been one of their greatest strengths, when they chose to use it. But no one knew for certain what had become of the species that had once terrified the entire galaxy. The only thing everyone agreed on was that the quarantine must never be broken, because somewhere in that vast red zone on every galactic map, the humans were still there, and the terror still echoed across 50,000 years of silence. High Arbiter Velnek finished his presentation to the assembled Galactic Council. and the holographic map of the galaxy still glowed with that ominous red zone at its center, where 12,000 star systems remained forever closed to outside contact. The younger ambassadors sat in uncomfortable silence while the elder representatives shifted in their seats as memories they would rather forget surfaced in their minds. "This is why we maintain the quarantine," Valnek said with all four of his eyes fixed on the audience. "Not because we fear what the humans might do to us now, but because we remember what they were willing to do in the past. They shattered coalitions that had existed for millions of years, and they destroyed species that thought themselves invincible, and they reshaped the entire galaxy according to their own vision. And when they were finished, they retreated into isolation with a warning that still echoes across every known system." Ambassador Kryn of the Valori Federation raised her appendage once more because the young diplomats still had questions that the historical archives had not answered. "High Arbiter, surely after 50,000 years of silence we could add least attempt to communicate with them. The humans who created the quarantine died long ago, and their descendants may have changed or evolved, or perhaps even forgotten why the borders were closed in the first place. There could be valuable knowledge and technology and opportunities for trade waiting for us, if we simply made the effort to reach out." Valmak's expression shifted into something that made the young ambassador want to shrink back in her seat. "You speak of the humans as if they were ordinary beings," he said in a voice that carried the weight of ancient fear. "But they were never ordinary. They took a species that was dying from self-inflicted wounds and transformed it into the most powerful force the galaxy has ever known. They did this in less than 3,000 years, which is nothing by galactic standards. And they did it because they absolutely refused to accept that suffering and injustice were simply the way things had to be." He gestured toward the glowing red zone on the map. 50,000 years is nothing to a species that learned to think in terms of geological ages. The humans waited 2 centuries before revealing their true capabilities, and they waited 2,000 years before the final war. They can certainly wait 50,000 years before deciding that their isolation has served its purpose. The chamber fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. "And when they do emerge?" Kryn asked quietly. "What happens then?" Valmak's 4 eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her. "Then we had better hope. We have built a galaxy they find acceptable. Because if we have not, then the terror will echo once again. And this time, there may be no one left to remember it." The council session ended shortly afterward, and the representatives returned to their ships and their homeworlds, carrying the weight of history that most of them had never truly understood before. But far across the galaxy, in a region of space that no outsider had entered in 50 millennia, something was happening that none of them could have imagined. A world that had once been called Earth and now bore a name that no outside species could pronounce. A council of elders gathered in a chamber that had not been used in 10,000 years. The beings who sat around the ancient table were still recognizably human in their basic form, but they had changed over the long centuries in ways both subtle and profound. Their lifespans now stretched across millennia, and their minds had been enhanced by technologies that the rest of the galaxy could not even conceive of. A holographic projection floated in the center of the room showing the proceedings of the Galactic Council that had just concluded, and they watched as Ambassador Kryn asked her questions and High Arbiter Valnek delivered his warnings. When the recording ended, the eldest among them spoke first. She was called simply the First, and her age was measured in tens of thousands of years, and she had been alive when Kevin Walsh VII announced the withdrawal. "They still remember us," she said with something like satisfaction in her voice. "They still fear what we might do," said another elder who was called the Keeper. "That is good," said a third who bore the title of Watcher, "because fear will keep them cautious, and caution will keep them from making the mistakes that nearly destroyed the galaxy before." The youngest member of the council, who was barely 2,000 years old and still considered impetuous by the standards of his peers, leaned forward with a question. "How much longer do we wait?" he asked. "And when do we know that they are ready for us to return?" The first considered this question for a long moment while the others waited in patient silence. We watch and we listen and we judge them by their actions rather than their words. When they have maintained peace for 10,000 years without our intervention, then perhaps they will have proven themselves. When they have built institutions that protect the weak without our guidance, then perhaps they will have learned. When they no longer need the threat of our return to keep them honest, then perhaps it will be time. She paused and looked around the table at faces that had watched civilizations rise and fall across thousands of generations. But that time has not yet come. They still cling to the old ways in their hearts, even as they speak of progress and equality. They still form secret alliances and plot against each other when they think no one is watching. They still need the fear we represent to keep them from destroying themselves and each other. The youngest elder nodded slowly as understanding dawned. So we continue to wait. We continue to watch. We continue to be the terror that echoes across the ages. The first smiled, and it was the same smile that Kevin Walsh had shown to the Moldari captain all those thousands of years ago when humanity had first learned what the galaxy was really like. "That is our burden," she said, "and it is also our gift. We taught them the power must serve justice, and now we must wait for them to truly believe it. We showed them what happens when the strong prey upon the weak, and now we must wait for them to choose differently. On their own, we are the memory of what they could become if they forget the lessons we taught them." The council adjourned, and the chamber fell silent once more. Across the vast reaches of human space life, continued in ways that the outside galaxy could never imagine, with cities that floated among the clouds and stations that orbited artificial stars and minds that stretched across networks spanning light years. Humanity had not stagnated in their isolation, but had continued to grow and change and evolve in directions that the elder species could not have predicted. They had become something new and something old at the same time because they still carried within them the memory of a small blue world that had nearly died and the determination that such a thing would never happen again, and they waited with the patience of a species that had learned to think in terms of forever. Somewhere in the Forbidden Zone, a child was born who would live to see the 10,000th anniversary of the withdrawal, and perhaps she would be the one to finally open the borders again, or perhaps her descendants 1,000 generations hence would make that choice when the time was finally right. It did not matter because humanity had nothing but time, and across the galaxy, the terror still echoed as a reminder of what could happen when a species pushed to the edge of extinction decided that survival was not enough. The warning beacons continued to broadcast their ancient messages. The border remained sealed against all who would enter, and deep within the Forbidden Zone, humanity watched and waited and remembered. They remembered what it had cost to build a better galaxy. They remembered what they had sacrificed to teach the universe that justice was not optional, and they remembered the promise they had made to themselves 50,000 years ago. When they decided to step back from the affairs of other species one day, they would return one day, they would see what the galaxy had become. Without them one day, they would judge whether their long silence had been worth the price. But that day had not yet come, so humanity continued to wait behind their borders of silence and warning, while the rest of the galaxy lived in the shadow of their memory, and the terror still echoed across the stars as it always had, and as it always would, until the humans themselves decided that the time for echoes was finally over. That was the truth that High Arbiter Velmec understood, even if he could never say it aloud. The quarantine was not meant to keep humanity contained. It was meant to give the galaxy time to become worthy of their return. Until that day came, the terror would continue to echo, forever and always a reminder and a warning. and a promise all wrapped together in 50,000 years of silence. The humans were still there. The humans were still watching, and the humans would never forget.